Hey guys, it's Alex and welcome to the Geeks Table. Some time ago I've made a video on how to use a Visual Studio Code on an iPad. This became the most viewed video on my channel, so thank you a lot for that. And now it's time for a follow-up video. In that one I showed you how to install an instance of a code server running somewhere and access it from your tablet. Some of the methods stopped working, for example the Servediter app is no longer in the App Store, and the others got limited. If you search for Copilot or Copilot chat in the code server, it won't show up due to the license limitations. Now, I know that you can bypass those limitations by installing the extensions as separate files, and Copilot will work actually, but Copilot chat still won't. So today, I'll show you how to create a Docker container that runs Ubuntu operating system that in turn runs official Visual Studio Code accessible from an iPad. In this tutorial, I will use Synology NAS to run Docker containers and will do all the manipulations from the iPad. I'm not trying to make a point that the iPad is superior than a Mac or PC. It's just fun to try new things. It's Geeks Table after all. Of course, you may use any server to host your Docker containers and any client of your choice to access them. And by the way, you'll need access to your router to forward the necessary ports. Feel free to use the chapters and necessary files from the description, and without further ado, let's get into it. If you will be using Synology NAS to run Docker containers, make sure that it supports running them. For this, go to your DSM or Disk Station Manager, open the Package Center, and search for Container Manager. And you should find this. If it's there, then it means that your Synology DSM is capable of running Docker containers. If you couldn't find a container manager, probably you have an older NAS, which has a different package that is called differently and has a different icon. I have such an older NAS here. In this case, also open the Package Center and search for Docker. And you should find this. If your Synology NAS either has this package called Docker or Container Manager, then it means that your NAS is capable of running Docker containers. If you could find neither of these, then probably your NAS is even older or have a different architecture and it doesn't support running Docker containers. But there is a handy link that I have over here, and it describes how to install Docker on unsupported Synology NAS. And it has quite an extensive list of models, and probably, hopefully, one of these is yours. I should emphasize though that this article is not a silver bullet, unfortunately. It may help you to install the Docker engine on your NAS, but it won't resolve all the problems that you may get while running the actual Docker containers. In this case, I really encourage you to go to the second-hand market and search for some affordable solutions. For example, one of the DSMs that I'm using right now is DS713 Plus, and 13 means that it was manufactured and produced in 2013, which is like over a decade from here, and it already supports running Docker. So if you go on eBay or any other shopping like second-hand market, you may get something like this for a very affordable price. But okay, let's say that we do have a Synology DSM that supports running Docker containers and we are good to go. Before we proceed, let's just draw a simple schema of the end result that we wish to achieve. So let's say that we have a browser where we type an HTTPS URL, a port, and a security token in order to access our VS Code instance. The reason why we need the HTTPS URL and not HTTP is because Microsoft dictates that we need a secure connection. So this browser can be anywhere in the internet, doesn't have to be in our local network, and when this request reaches our router, the router translates this URL, port, and the token to our Synology DSM. Or if you're using something else aside from the Synology DSM, it could be any server of your choice. The DSM will convert this HTTPS URL to an HTTP URL, and it will convert the port that we got from the router to another port, its internal one. And then it will pass all of this into the Docker container that's running our Ubuntu operating system. The Docker container in turn will convert this internal port to its own port. It will verify the security token, and if the security token is correct, then it will request the Visual Studio Code to be shown in our browser. Now, I understand that this may look quite scary, especially when you have never done anything like this before, but fear not, step by step we shall do it. So, there are quite many ports involved here, and it's a good idea to have everything written down. So let's open our notes. So first there was a router port, and in this tutorial I will use 7777 as a router port. Next one is DSM port, our Synology port, and in this tutorial I will use 9797. And the third was the Docker port, and I will use 8585. And the benefit of having this in a written form is that you actually can change these ports to any numbers of your choice. So if during this instruction later I will use 7777 as a router port, you can look into your notes, check the number that you have under the router port, and use this instead of mine. Also, let's make a note of the IP address of our Synology DSM. We may need it later. So our DSM IP is this one. Of course, yours will be different. Okay, we don't need this now and this now. And now we need to go to our router. And here we need to find the port forwarding page. Now I understand that every router is different, of course, and I obviously don't know which model you have and where port forwarding is in your router. So here I totally trust you that you could find the IP address of your router, log in successfully, and then find the port forwarding page. So once you are there, the UI should be more or less similar to what I have. You should have a list of port forwarding rules, like here. It may be empty like mine, and we need to add a new one. So I will click this plus button. I will name it as VS Code. Some routers don't have a name field, so even if you have it, you can just skip it. It's just for convenience to have some name. The IP address will be exactly the one that we just wrote down. So let's make this page a bit smaller. Okay, so let's type 192.168.168.0.146. Protocol will be TCP. Type just port. We don't need a range of ports. We need just one. And here we'll use the router port 7777. And LAN port will be router port as well, 7777. Okay, so what's the idea of this rule exactly? So let's say that we are typing this URL in our browser, vscode.geekstable.com:7777. And it goes to our router, and because our router now has this rule, it understands, okay, we have exactly this port that I have a rule for. And it means that it will transfer or forward, hence the name, this request to this IP address that we've written down. And this IP address is our DSM IP. So now this request will be handled not by our router, but by our DSM. And by the end of this tutorial, DSM will have everything that we need to provide us the Visual Studio Code instance. So this is the first, but very important step to complete this tutorial. Okay, so I will remove this made up URL, we don't need it. We'll click apply. In my router, I need to turn it on and then click apply again. And yay, we have the port forwarding rule. And we can switch to the next step. And here we need to enable SSH access on our Synology DSM. If you don't know what an SSH access means, it basically allows us to connect either an iPad or a Mac or any other SSH client to our Synology DSM through the terminal. Why do we need a terminal access? We are going to build a Docker container in the future of this tutorial. And the only way to do it on the Synology DSM is through typing the commands through the terminal. Unfortunately, we don't have a fancy UI to do this in a fancy way. I know that enabling SSH access is a security concern because basically anyone can connect through the terminal to your DSM knowing your credentials and do some crazy stuff there. So I really encourage you to enable it, finish the tutorial, and then disable it to the initial state. If you need SSH access for anything else, it's up to you, you know what you're doing. But otherwise, I really encourage you to go and disable this setting once you're done with this tutorial. So let's switch to our DSM, open the control panel, click Terminal and SNMP, and here check Enable SSH Service. Now I do prefer to have a custom port instead of the default 22, and in my tutorials I just type 3535, and it's up to you if you want to follow this or not. Regardless of that, let's make a note and type DSM SSH port, and in my case it will be 3535. Okay, I'll click apply. It will show me a warning. Click OK. All right, now we have SSH enabled. All right, and the next step is to create a custom URL, which we will be typing in order to get the Visual Studio Code instance. So let's return back to the control panel. Click Home, select External Access, select DNS, click Add, and let's select the service provider. I will be using Synology. The host name, let it be geekvscode, and let's select something short like myds.me, and it will be our host name. Let's make a note of it. Host name geekvscode.myds.me. Now, because we're using Synology as our service provider, it requires us to log in into the Synology account. So if you are not yet logged in, it will show you a login button somewhere over here. Once you're logged in, it will show you your Synology account email here, and you're good to go. I'm logged in, so I will proceed. I will check get a certificate from Let's Encrypt and set it as default, and click OK. Click OK once more, and we need to wait a little bit. And we've created our host name and the certificate. Now, if you didn't get any errors, you're good to proceed through this tutorial. If you got an error saying like host name was created, but the certificate was not, then try this thing. So first of all, select this line and click delete. Then we need to go to the network, then select manually configure DNS server. And instead of this one, type 1.1.1.1, 8.8.8.8. Click apply, and then return back to the external access, dynamic DNS, click add, and basically repeat everything that we did during the last step. Usually it helps while creating a certificate, so then you just go back to the network and uncheck this manually configure DNS server, click apply, and you're good to go. If it couldn't create a certificate, don't worry. On the next step, we will try to recreate it manually. All right, so now we need to do a few more manipulations with our URL. The thing is that now we have a general URL that points to our whole DSM, but we need a prefix. Like google.com points to the search, but if you type images.google.com, it will point to the image search. If you use store.google.com, it will point to the pixel shop. If you use drive.google.com, it will go to the Google Drive. And we need this prefix in order to type like code, geekvscode.myds.me, and it will open Visual Studio Code. And later we can use, I don't know, drive.geekvscode.myds.me, and it will open Synology Drive, something like that. So now we need to create this kind of rule that says, okay, now we need to respect and handle those prefixes. So in order to do that, let's open security of our control panel, go to the certificate, and here we may have two different situations. We may have two certificates like I have, if you didn't get any errors on the previous step, or you may have just Synology if you had an error at the previous step. In any of these cases, we need to click Add, and if you had an error, so you have just Synology here, you select Add a new certificate. And if you didn't have any errors on the previous step and you have two of these, select Replace an existing certificate and select your custom URL. And here I will click Next. Here I will select Get a certificate from the Let's Encrypt and check Set as a default certificate. Click Next. Here I will just copy this domain name and paste it over here. I will use the email of my Synology account. And in this field, I will type asterisk, then dot, and then type the host name again. And I will need to remove this space here. So it will be asterisk, dot, and in my case, geekvscode.myds.me. And basically this rule says, hey, we now should respect the prefixes that will be instead of this asterisk. So if instead of the asterisk there will be like code.geekvscode.myds.me, we should respect it. If it will be drive.geekvscode.myds.me, we should respect it as well. So anything at the place of this asterisk. Okay, now let's click Done. And we are done. All right, so now the certificate knows about the prefixes, but our Synology DSM doesn't know about them quite yet. For this, we need to create a reverse proxy rule. So let's go to our control panel, select Login Portal, click Advanced, and click Reverse Proxy. Now let's click Create, and let's name it VS Code. Okay, so the protocol will be HTTPS, because the Visual Studio Code requires an HTTPS protocol. The host name will be code dot and then our general host name, and delete this space one. The port will be router port 7777, enable HSTS. Destination will be HTTP, localhost, and the port will be the DSM port 9797. Before clicking Save, let's go to the custom header, click Create, and select WebSocket. And now let's click Save. Okay, and now we have a reverse proxy rule that basically redirects this source to this destination. And let's make a note of it. VS Code URL will be HTTPS code. Let's copy the host name, then colon 7777. Okay, let's click Close. Let's close the control panel. Go to the Package Center, search for the Container Manager, and install it if you haven't installed it already. And again, if you have an older NAS, then instead of the Container Manager, you should search for Docker and install that one. Usually after the installation, the Container Manager or Docker creates a folder where it will store all the running Docker containers. So let's check if it have installed it in our case. So let's open the control panel, select Shared Folder, and we can see that we have a Docker folder which was created by the Container Manager. If you don't have one, you should click Create, create Shared Folder, name it anyhow you want, let's say Docker. We don't need a recycle bin. Click Next, 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 and by the end of this wizard, you should have the same Docker folder. All right, we have one already, so we don't need creating one. Let's close the control panel. And let's create some subfolders there. So let's open File Station, open the Docker folder, and here let's create another folder. One of them will be VS Code. This is the folder where our future Docker container will be. Click OK. Click Create once more, create folder, and create a folder called Sources. And here we will store all the sources for our Docker container. Click OK. Now while we are here, let's select Sources, right-click, Properties, and check this location. And make a note of it as well. Sources location, like this. Okay, let's pull it down a bit so we will have everything that we need. Now we need to go to the description of this video and download the code snippets and the source files that you will need during the next step. So download them to your iPad or your Mac or basically anywhere you are following this tutorial and open it with any text editor. Even the Notes app of the iPad will work. I will use the Code app because I have this app already. You don't have to buy it. I just find it useful. So yeah, open these 3 files with any text editor of your choice. I will open the Code app, open folder, and open these files. So let's quickly go through them. We don't need code snippets just right now. Let's open the Dockerfile. If you have never seen a Dockerfile, it's basically a set of instructions describing how to build this Docker image and what it should have. The base of this image is Ubuntu, and the version is 22.04. At the time of this recording, this is the version of the long-term support Ubuntu, LTS, and I prefer to use it just because it's stable. You may replace it with any version of your choice, but I will keep it as is. So let's go through the code and I will point you to the places where you need to make changes. So first of all, the name of the user of the Ubuntu operating system, which I call VS user. You may keep it using as is, or you may name it to any user of your choice. Then the password of the user, I will have it as 111 just for simplicity, but you might want to rename it to something more secure. Then the token. This is the security token that we'll need to type in our URL so that the Visual Studio Code would open. And of course, you might want to replace it with something more secure. I will be using 123 again, just for the simplicity. And while we're at it, let's make a note of it. So our VS Code URL will be not just like this, but after the port, there will be question mark. The parameter will be TKN for token equals, and my token is 123. If you replace it, you need to replace 123 with your token. Okay, let's return back. Next, we set the root password. And for me, it's change this with a capital T, which you might want to change to something else. And then there is a set of instructions that sets up the Visual Studio Code and the SSH service, just in case we want to access our Docker container in the future. For the Visual Studio Code, it exposes the port 8585, and that's exactly the Docker port that we wrote over here. So if you decided to use a different port here, instead of 8585, return back to your Dockerfile and replace 8585 with the new port of your choice. Okay, once we're done here, we start this startscript.sh. So let's switch to there and check it as well. Here we have a backup set of values for our user, password, and token. So if you have changed it in the Dockerfile, be sure to change it here as well. And also let's check the line 21, where we start our Visual Studio Code. Here we also set the port as 8585. And again, if you have changed the Docker port over here to something else, be sure to return back to this startscript.sh and replace 8585 with your port of choice. That's basically it. Once you're done changing both of these files, let's close them, switch to our DSM, open the sources folder, click upload, and upload those two files over here. Choose files. We need Dockerfile and startscript.sh. Let's open them. And the files appeared over here. Great. Now it means that we are ready to build our Docker container. In order to do so, we need to connect to our Synology DSM through the SSH through our terminal. If you are using a Mac, then basically open the terminal, type SSH space, then the name of your DSM user, in my case it's just NAS user, add, and then the IP address of the DSM. In my case is 192.168.0.146. And because I've used the custom SSH port 3535, I need to type -p 3535. If you kept it as default 22, you don't have to type -p 3535, obviously. Then you click enter. It will require your user's password. And once you type it, it may ask you to add a fingerprint, so you will need to type yes, click enter again, and once you're done, you're fully connected through the SSH to your DSM. But because I will be using the iPad for that, I will need a special app. My SSH app of choice is Terminus. It has some paid features, but the free tier is enough for our needs. Let's click New Host, label it as our DSM. The IP will be DSM IP 192.168.0.146. The SSH should be enabled. The port is the SSH port, 3535 in my case. The username is the username of the NAS, which is NAS user in my case, and the password. You may keep the password blank, and then you'll have to type it in the terminal every time when it's requested, or you may type it over here, and then it will be preserved here and passed to the terminal every time you need it. I will type it over here. Next, you can select the terminal design if you wish, and click Save. And let's connect. It will ask us to add a fingerprint for the first time. Let's click Continue. Let's make the font a bit bigger. Close this tab. And now we are connected to our Synology DSM through our iPad app. Great. I will be typing the commands that you may find in the code snippets file over here, so you don't have to type them, you can just copy and paste them. There will be a few places where you might want to change a few things, and I will point you to those, but otherwise you can just freely copy and paste those. So, first of all, we are in the root folder right now, and we need to switch to our sources folder. So let's type cd, which stands for change directory, and let's go to our notes and copy the path of our sources folder. Let's paste it over here, type enter, and now we are pointing to our sources folder. Great. Now we need to build the Docker container. In this case, we need to type sudo space docker space build space -t space VS Code Ubuntu space dot. Now this command will build our Docker image based on the Dockerfile that we've been looking through. That's what we want. But let's imagine that we finish building this Docker image and then you decide, okay, I need to update the Ubuntu version in this Dockerfile, or the password, or the username. So you apply some changes to this Dockerfile. You save it, then you go back to the terminal and you decide to rebuild it again, and you use this command. Now the problem is that this command, when being run for the second time, may use the cached version of the Dockerfile, and it may ignore the changes in the Dockerfile that you've just done. In this case, you might want to build this image without any cache. In this case, after -t, you might want to add space no -cache. And be sure that there is another space over here. In this case, this command will not use the cache, and it will always use the Dockerfile that you have in the sources folder. But okay, we are building it for the first time, so we don't need this no cache parameter, so I will keep the command in its initial state. And let's click enter. Because we used sudo, it requires our password, and because I typed it in our configuration, I can just click paste password for NAS user. And now it started building our Docker image. Building a Docker image may require some time, depending on how powerful your Docker machine is. In my case, it will be around 30 minutes, so see you in 30 minutes, or for you it will be just 1 second. While it's compiling, I wanted to share my experience with yet another SSD enclosure from ACASIS. If you've ever been following my channel, you know that I'm quite a fan of those. This new one that they sent to me is called TBU405ProMax, and it really maxes out the capabilities. Have a look. It is a Thunderbolt enclosure that holds 2 SSDs which can be accessed as a RAID array. It supports an HDMI 4K 60 signal. It has an additional 10 gigabits per second USB-A port, an active cooling which you can turn on and off, and on top of that you can connect one more Thunderbolt enclosure thanks to the daisy chain Thunderbolt signal. The downside for me is that you have to keep it connected to the 100-watt power brick all the time, but hey, at least the brick is included and it charges your laptop. If you're interested in this enclosure or you wish to have a truly portable one, check their website. The link will be in the description. And we'll be back setting up our Docker container. Alright, 30 minutes have passed and we are done. Let's open the container manager and check if the image has been added to the list. Let's make this window a bit bigger. Okay, click image. And yeah, we can see that we have the base image that we've used, the Ubuntu of the version 22.04, and our VS Code Ubuntu, and it's in the list as well. That's great. Next, I'm going to show you one more terminal command, which can be useful in 2 cases. Imagine that your image has successfully built, but it has not been added to this list, and you need to add it manually. Or everything went fine, but you wish to preserve this image as an archive or a backup, so you could deploy it on a different machine or on this machine if something goes wrong. So you just want an archive of the build image. Personally, I'm going to do that because I don't want to wait for another 30 minutes in order to build the same container on a different NAS. So let's switch to our SSH client. And just in case you may already have been disconnected, I'll just type exit to emulate that. So let's reconnect again. In order to archive our image, first of all, we need to switch to the sources folder again. So let's type cd and our sources folder, and then type sudo docker save VS Code Ubuntu latest, then vertical line, gzip greater than VS Code Ubuntu .tar.gz, and type enter. Type the password, and let's wait a bit. Just in case you have this command in the code snippets, so you don't have to type it manually. Once you see this line, it means that the operation has completed. So let's go to our DSM. Let's open the Docker folder, open the sources folder, and we'll see that our archive of our image is located over here. So just as an example, you don't have to repeat this after me. Let's say that my image was not added automatically. I will delete it from the container manager. You don't have to delete it. I'm just doing it as an example. Okay, so I don't have it. Now, if I want to add my archived image, I need to click Action, Import, Add from File, from this DSM, go to the Sources, select this archive, and click Select. And after a few moments, this archive will be extracted and the image will be added. In case you're using an older NAS which doesn't have Container Manager but does have Docker, then it has a slightly different interface. Let me show you. So I'm opening Docker here. In order to add an image, we need to go to the image, and here click Add, and just Add from File. And here pick up the sources folder and your archive, and it will follow the same path. All right, let's switch back to our DSM. And now let's run this image. For this, let's switch for a moment to the code app. Now we need to go to the code snippets and find the command that looks like this. This is the command that will run the Docker container based on the Docker image that we've looked at a moment ago. So first of all, we need to name it. I will name it as VS Code Ubuntu. You can give another name if you want. The flag -d shows that there won't be any output in the terminal while running this command. And there are two -p flags where we map internal ports to our DSM ports. So the first port is used by the VS Code, and the second port is used by the SSH server of our Docker container. If we look at our nodes, let's drag them over here, and then we'll notice that 9797 is exactly the DSM port, and 8585 is exactly the Docker port. So if you have changed them here, change them here as well. Now these ports, as I've said, will be used by the VS Code. The other pair will be used by the SSH server. So let's add a note over here. So Docker SSH port will be 2222. Now, as I've said, SSH is a security vulnerability. So if you don't want to use an SSH server in your Docker container, you can just remove this mapping, and then the SSH server basically won't be reachable from the outside. Next flag is -v, where we map our folders, and this is exactly the VS Code folder that we've created in our DSM. So just in case, let's switch to our DSM, go to the Docker folder, to the VS Code, right-click, Properties, copy this location, go back to our code, and paste it over here. It's exactly the same. Alright, that's it. Now we need to copy this command and put it into our SSH client. Now just a small note, some SSH clients don't understand this symbol. It's a reverse slash that allows us to split the command into different lines. Now if you will try to run this command as is and you'll get some errors, you may try to remove these symbols and basically convert this command to one line. Just don't forget that there should be some spaces. And then you should try running this command in this format. One of the reasons why I use Terminus app is that it supports this format. So I will just keep it as is, copy, go to the Terminus app, paste it, type the password, and in a few seconds, the container will be deployed. Now let's switch to the DSM, go to our container manager, and check if the container is running. Go to the containers, and we see that the container is running fine. If you have the same status, so everything works fine, then proceed to the next step. Otherwise, I'll show you how to troubleshoot. So if you had a problem here, I will suggest you to stop the container. And once it's stopped, then select delete. So you will delete the container entirely. Then go back to the run code and remove this line. So this flag, as I said before, it removes all the output during the build process. So when you run it like this, it will show you all the steps that it's taking in order to build this container. And if there was a problem during the build, it will show it in the output, and then it will be a good starting point to find the cause while it's not running for you. Okay, let's go back to our DSM. Okay, we have our container running, but we haven't checked if the Visual Studio Code is running. So we need this URL, and actually we need to delete this space, like this. Copy, create a new tab, and paste it. Click Enter, and we see that the latest version of the Visual Studio Code server is downloading. Please wait a moment. Okay, let's wait. And we have our Visual Studio Code running. Okay, so we have a Visual Studio Code running on our iPad that is connected to the Wi-Fi, and it's in the same network as the Synology DSM. But I have another iPad that has a cellular connection. So let's check if our Visual Studio Code accessible from the internet. So now I'm in the private browsing, so there will be no caching. I'm not connected to the Wi-Fi. I'm connected only to the mobile data. Okay, so let me paste the same URL that I had. Okay, click go, fingers crossed. And yeah, we have our Visual Studio Code accessible from the internet. So if Visual Studio Code works for you over the Wi-Fi and over the internet, then you can proceed to the next step. If you have some troubles, then bear with me. So let's say that Visual Studio Code is accessible for you over Wi-Fi, but you can't access it over the internet. Then the problem is in your router. So the port forwarding rules that we've made, probably they're not working as expected. So do check it over there. If you can't access Visual Studio Code neither over Wi-Fi or over the internet, then go with me to the DSM. So first of all, let's select our container, click Details, and here we might want to check our log. You may find some errors over here, and if it's hard to read it like this, you may export it and read it in other software. You may also click Action and open the terminal. And if there are any errors, you may also see them here. And as you remember, we've declared a port 2222 to access our Docker container over SSH. So if we want to access our Docker containers over SSH, let's go to our Terminus app. Let's go back, create a new host. Let's name it Docker SSH. The IP address will be the same as the address of our DSM, this one. use SSH will be enabled. The port will be Docker SSH port 2222. The username will be the username of our Ubuntu. Let's quickly go to our Dockerfile and check. So our user is vsuser and the password is 111. Let's come back. So the user is vsuser. Password is 111. Save. And let's connect. Let's add a fingerprint. And as you can see, we're connected to our Ubuntu that is running in our Docker container. In the code app, in the start script.sh, we have this line. Let's create a new file just in case. Test. We will paste this line over here. Let's make it a bit smaller so we could see the whole line. And let's close this panel. Okay, so this is the command that runs the code from the terminal. What we need to do here is to replace this VS username with our user, which is VS user, and the connection token with our token, which in my case it was 123. And now we can copy this command into our SSH, paste it over here, and run. And once you do that, you'll see the output and probably the errors that prevent you from using the VS Code. So we have our Visual Studio Code running, so let's check if the extensions actually work. Let's search for Copilot. And yeah, it's in the list. So click Install and also Copilot Chat. Of course, we'll need to log into our GitHub account. And let's type, I don't know, what's the difference between an interface and an abstract class. Okay, and actually what we can do, we can share and add to the home screen. Add, and if we click it from here, we will have a separate code window. Oh, and by the way, for those who still have Servediter, this app, if you have ever installed it, it has been added to your app library, so you can reinstall it again. So if you have access to it, you still can use it with the actual tutorial. So let's run it. And let's pop up our notes. Let's copy this VS Code URL all together with HTTPS and with a token. Then switch to the code server, select self-hosted server, and post it over here. Be sure that there are no spaces, like this one. Okay, like this, no space here, no space in the beginning, just like that. All together with HTTPS and with a token. Click Save. And now we have our good old Servediter running Visual Studio Code from our Docker container. And here we are. We have our Visual Studio Code running on an iPad, with all the extensions working just fine. I hope this tutorial was useful to you. If it was, please hit a like and consider subscribing and consider sharing this tutorial. It's been Alex, and see you at the Geeks table. Bye bye.